Looking out over the yard on this beautiful late April morning before I start work on the house, I don't see a single squirrel in the yard anywhere. They're usually out running around. And the reason I know they're running around is because twice now they have chewed away the bottom of the garage door jamb. And I've got to get this replaced before the guys come in and put a new garage door up. Got a big project here, so let's get started. First thing I need to do is remove this brick mold. There's brick mold around the entire garage door, and it's all going to have to come off because we're going to do brand new casing when we put the siding on and the new garage door. But regardless, I'm going to show you the method I use to remove casings and trim to protect the walls and protect the casing in case you're going to reuse it. I always take a couple of paint scrapers, work them into the gap, work my pry tool in there, and apply pressure to pull the casing loose. And when I do that, you notice there's no damage to any of the surfaces. Very important if you're going to be redoing something. As you can see, I ran into a bit of an issue with the top jamb on this door when I took the brick mold off. This is a prefab home, and that wasn't nailed in very much. Just a few small nails and it dropped. So what I have just done is I took my drill with a counter bore and went along and put a couple holes in so I can sink the screws. And I'm going to go along now and just put some construction screws in a couple of spots to draw that back up into position where it needs to be before I go ahead and start on the rest of the door. Alright, we have that top jamb secured again, and it just goes to show you never know what to expect when you're working on an older structure like this. This home was built in the early 1970s, and being built in a factory, sometimes the things they do don't necessarily hold up that well in the field after 50 years. I will true that up plumb with the laser line at some point. I don't need to worry about that today. So now let's get back to fixing the jamb. So now with the brick mold off, the next step is to remove this seal piece, this filler trim piece, and then the jamb itself. I have to be careful up on top because I have to weave that jamb back in to the top jamb. So there'll be some cutting and fitting involved with that. Alright, we'll take now these other casings off. I'll start with the seal itself, and I'm going to use the same method I did to get the brick mold off. Drive a scraper in there, cut through the caulk. Obviously there's caulk on all of this. Of course, pry bar in, give it a push. We've got that started. Just as with the brick mold, I'm going to work my way up, take that off, this inner casing piece, and we'll come back. We've got both those casings off, and you might ask, well, if I'm getting rid of this, why was I so careful taking those pieces off? I have to recreate that inner jamb from a piece of stock, from MDF stock, and I have to recreate this door jamb from another piece of MDF. So I want to use this to get the notch dimensions So that's why I was a little careful taking those off. Otherwise, I'd have just pulled the whole jamb in one shot. But I have to be careful up on top not to damage that top jamb as well. I now have both trim pieces removed, pretty much undamaged except for the squirrel damage at the bottom. Now we're ready to take those up to the workshop in the shed and spend some quality time with the miter saw and the table saw to get some new pieces cut to fit back in. We're ready to start measuring and marking to make our jamb boards, trim pieces. We're going to start with the big one because that will have to be notched, shortened, and ripped to the right width because it's 4.5 inches wide. And the board I'm starting with is 5.5 inches. That'll be the easy part. Do that on the table saw. And for length, I need 84 7/8 inches. We'll cut that and rip it last because the tricky part is going to be cutting the notch in this board. I need a notch that's 3/4 of an inch tall here to fit into the upper jamb piece. And I got to cut it down 3/8 of an inch into this board. So we'll get that marked, we'll get set up, and we'll cut that notch out. The other board, that's going to be pretty easy. It's 3¼ inches wide, and so is my stock. I'll just cut that to length when I cut this to length. It's time to start marking now for the cuts with the miter saw. I measured the old board more closely, and it's actually 11/16 of an inch instead of 3/4 of an inch for this cut for the joint to fit into the top trim board. So I've marked it at 11/16 of an inch and marked a line across with the square. Now the other issue I have is the board that came off is a full 3/4 inch board. And this board, the MDF board, is only 5/8 of an inch, so 1/8 of an inch short. That means I can't use the old board as a gauge to set the miter saw depth to make these cuts. I'm going to have to measure and set the blade accordingly. So I'll do that next. To get the depth of my cut, what I did was set the depth of my square 32 of an inch short of the 3/8 depth that I needed for this cut to allow for a pencil mark, drew a pencil line across there. And so now I have 3/8 of an inch depth marked here. And then I also extended the ruler out and carried the other line for the roughly 3/4 of an inch down into the side just for a reference point. What I have to do now is set the depth of my miter cut to just take that material out and leave this roughly 1/4 inch of material left at the bottom. I have a piece of stock that's exactly 1/4 inch thick. I'm just using that as a gauge to set the depth of my cut. So I center the spindle of the saw over the center of that piece of wood, and I'm just a little bit above it. So I'm going to go over to the side here, and you can see as I adjust my depth setting with the screw over here, I can just gradually lower this down till I contact the wood. And I have my depth set now to allow the 1/4 inch to remain for that material. So I have the board clamped in place where I have the saw blade, the edge of the tooth just at the edge of that pencil line so the pencil line is not covered. I made sure the saw is set perfectly at 90 degrees, and the pitch, if there's no pitch on the blade, that is set at 0. So I'm going to make my first cut along the line, and then we will work our way across the board by moving the board to remove the rest of the material and clean it up with a chisel when we're done. So let's make that first cut. All right, we've made our first clean cut. We're going to loosen the clamp so that we can slide the board, slide it over about a saw blade width, clamp it again so it doesn't move on us. And this time we're going to turn the vacuum cleaner on. I'm going to continue this process now until I remove the rest of that material, and we'll have a nice clean joint in here. An oversight I made in making these cuts was I didn't allow for the fact with the blade raised up, it wouldn't make the cut all the way to the end. So to finish the cuts on the far side of this, I put what I know to be square oak spacer block in to bring this out so that the blade could travel enough to cut the rest of that material. So I've done that. Now I'm going to trim this up with a chisel. Lightly, just to make sure it's clean. Always good to have a good sharp chisel, which I try to do. And there we have our joint. We're ready to rip this to the right width and cut it to length. I have the board marked, ready to make the straight cut. 84 7/8 of an inch, double checked it with the old board. Notice that I'm always wearing my hearing protection when I'm using the saw. And we are ready to get to the table saw and rip this to the right width. Saw has been set up. I got it from the back of the cave where it was buried after this winter. Took me a while to dig it out. Got it out here where by an open door. Got a mark just to make sure that I've got this inch. I set the blade width. I set the 1 inch width to the outside edge of the tooth, to the guide. That'll give me my 1 inch of material removal. Let's fire this thing up. And there, the board is cut to length and ripped, ready to install. Let's work on that next. Before I nail these boards in, I have to make sure that that top jamb board is, the end is level with the end down there, because as you recall, that sagged a little bit, and this head and the top is just a little bit out of shape because that header has sunk a little bit in the center. So I'm going to go get the laser, and we're going to shoot a line across to that other edge to find the mark on this side where the height should be for that board. My plan was to use the laser level to get a mark on this side over here to set the height of that jamb board. However, the sunlight is so bright today, I was having a hard time seeing the laser reflect across that 16-foot span. So I put some reflective tape over in that corner, and then I was able to see the reflection of the laser and move it into position. So what I did was I took the laser level, put it on float, moved it along till I got reflection on the far side, just at the top of that tape. And that would be where the ledger board sits on that end, where the line crosses the board here, and put my mark. That's the height now that board has to sit at. Right there. And I can see that it's the laser right there. So I'll go get some shims and we'll go set the height of that top jamb board. Okay, I had to play with this a little bit. I put a very thin wedge in here. This top header pitches in a little bit, so I had to bring the front end of this out. So I go on my mark with a level, and I have to ignore this because there's still a little sag here. It has to be taken up, and we'll do that with a string. But I get the level on the mark line here, and it lines up with this edge, so I've got that level and in line for setting the other jamb. We'll straighten this other stuff out later with a string, put shims in, and draw it up with finishing screws. Getting this top jamb set has turned into quite an adventure. Had two things going on here. It was a little high to begin with. I had to bring this front end down, but part of the problem is it was teetering in here on a hump, and it was low in the back, which exaggerated the tip in front. So I had to set a screw back in here to level this up, and now I finally have it to a point where this jamb board will sit flush along the edge of the garage and lines up across here and closes the gap. So I'm ready to shim this out and set it in place. First, I'm going to lay a bead of caulk in here to set that up in, and then we're going to shim it out on top and then check with our level and shim it out as we go along to the bottom. I have the top lined up and snugged in place with a couple of shims to hold it tight. I'm going to drill up there and put in a galvanized finish nail to hold that in place. I did that by setting a couple of shims down here to put some pressure on that. Now that's obviously bowed this out a little bit, but that won't matter. We're going to get that anchored on top. Then we're going to check with our laser level and bring this thing in line and shim our way down, drill, and set finish nails. And we're lined up flush along the front of the garage, ready to set it in place. We've got this all lined up and everything flush. We'll drill a pilot hole so we don't break something. Take one of our galvanized finish nails. Always use those for outside work like this. Drive it in. Take a nail set, get it in all the way so we can fill that later. There, we've got a starting point. Now we can work our way down. I'm going to lay a straight edge along here, get the shim set, get this thing anchored. All right, I'm going to check this to make sure it's straight. I just use this other trim board because I know it's straight. That tells me I'm in line. I'm going to take my level. I know it's not a 4-foot level, but it'll work for this. I've kicked that bottom out so that when I hold this on here and hold the level on, I'm plumb. We can take a look at the bubble in here. We've got that plumb now, top to bottom, and I'll use this board to make sure I stay straight when I nail this thing in. Now here's the problem. If you just go by measurements alone, you can see it's wider at the bottom than it is at the top. So that's why we have to do this, to make sure our door jamb is plumb. So I'll go ahead and start shimming and nailing, and we'll look at it when we're done. It's pretty easy now. We've got everything plumb. So we just lay this board up against here. We've got everything shimmed. Line it up with the other board on the back. We'll drill a couple pilot holes right where the shims are and set this in with a couple of smaller galvanized finished nails. I want to make sure I've got everything pushed up tight to the top, which I do. I'm going to double check my alignment. I'm going to start down here. I'm going to set that first piece. Get these nails started in the hole. Make sure we've got everything pushed up tight before we drive them in. Get this lined up, everything flush. Let's set these two. Yep, we're still good. I'll come back and set those after I get the rest of the nails in. So let's drill a couple more holes. Drive these in. I've got these in. Like I said, I'll set them later. Now I'm going to go up, get the top two, and I'll get the bottom two. Use a nail set, drive those in, and we'll have the jamb replaced. A repaired jamb. Now the secret is to keep the squirrels away. The next step will be to straighten up the top jamb. That was a little uneven after I took the brick mold off, and I'm going to do that by lining it up with this piece of baler twine that I've run from end to end to give me a straight edge to follow. I will shim it along as I go and put screws in to secure it. Now with the top jamb all shimmed and secured, so it's in a straight line with the string I put across, I can go ahead and break off the ends of those shims, get out here, sand, and prime and paint the jamb so it's ready to go to put the new door in. Now that all the loose paint's been scraped off, the rough edges sanded smooth, and everything wiped down with a little bit of hot water with a mild detergent in it like Mr. Clean, we want to go in and fill these nail and screw holes and smooth them out so they dry. And that will be the last step before we prime all the surfaces and get ready for paint tomorrow. The prep work is finished and we're ready to put a primer coat on all of this. The prep work is probably the most time-consuming and important part of a painting job, to make sure you've got all the old loose paint off, everything is clean, everything is filled. Now you get the primer on. Once the primer is on and dry, it's a cinch to put the top coat on. I'm going to prime this with just a good high quality water-based primer for interior and exterior use. Our primer is dried overnight. It'll actually dry in an hour, but finished it late in the day yesterday. Now it's dried, it's really set. One more thing before we put the top coat of paint on is I want to caulk along where these pieces meet, get it sealed up good, and then this is paintable caulk. We'll paint right over that. We'll have a nice finished product. This joint is finished, smoothed out. We've got a nice smooth caulk line going up to the top. With the caulking completed, we are now ready for paint. I'm using a paint that I had mixed by the manufacturer of the siding to match exactly to the trim that's going to be going on when we side the house. And it is an exact match. I've tested it. They do a really good job. So this is a good high quality exterior paint that I'm applying. And once it's on, everything's going to tie in perfectly. So let's start painting. And there we have it, the finished product. Jamb replaced, upper jamb straightened out, everything scraped and cleaned up, primed, and painted to match the siding that'll be going on. We are now ready to put a new garage door on. And here we have the completed garage door. Got put in a couple of days ago. To complement the completely repaired door jamb. And I've sprayed that with apple cider vinegar to keep the squirrels from chewing on it, and hopefully this one won't get ruined. If you found this video on replacing this door jamb useful and informative, then I ask you to please subscribe and click like. Thank you for watching.